human lives are at risk in every logistics operation that we conduct. They are building platforms that don't communicate with other platforms, deliberately building platforms that don't communicate with other platforms. If everything feels rosy, if every time you're speaking to people, it feels comfortable, if every time you're interacting with a staff paper, you're hearing what you want to hear and you're seeing what you want to see, you're wrong.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us on Data Malarkey today is John McFall, a master of logistics. Logistics, a term that originated in the military, is defined as, or at least it's my first attempt at, the process of coordinating and moving resources, people, materials, inventory, equipment, and increasingly data, from one location to storage at the desired destination. John, too, originated in the military, and he has deep and broad logistical experience in both military and business. He spent more than 15 years in the Royal Air Force, including tours of duty in some of the world's toughest hotspots under the most extreme conditions. These included active service in both Kandahar in Afghanistan and Basra in Iraq. John's transition to Civvy Street saw him bring his logistics skills and know-how to the world's fifth biggest business, Amazon, whose market capitalization as of October 2023, when we're recording this episode, was $1.3 trillion. At Amazon, John looked after operations, supply chain, transportation, and logistics. Until the middle of last year, he was the head of global specialty practice, looking after those core disciplines. He joins us today to help us appreciate and understand that logistical challenges are best solved by smarter use of data. John, welcome to Data Malarkey.
Excellent. Thanks for having us along, Sam.
Brilliant. Now, listen, I trust that's a decent summary of who you are and what you do, and most particularly what you've done in your rich and varied career. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I've got wrong?
I can add some additional color. So, in the Air Force, I spent a total of 18 years before leaving. And a bit like all of us who serve, the truth is we're doing tours about every 18 months to 2 years. So I have a fairly broad range of experiences from, running recruit training through to looking after the intellectual property of the Air Force whilst at MOD. And then, of course, the normal operational command aspects. Within the Air Force, I was part of a specialization known as the RAF regiment. In Amazon, I spent, it's a large company again, so lots of moving around. So I spent the first 2 years of my 6 years in Amazon working with Amazon operations, so looking after fulfillment centers, predominantly on the inbound side in the big FCs, and then both inbound and outbound when I was dealing with small and light. But I spent the vast majority of my time in Amazon with an organization known as Amazon Web Services, which is the world's largest provider of cloud technologies. And therefore, we are underpinning all sorts of interesting businesses such as Netflix, Disney Plus, and various other components that maybe we've all heard of, but not reflected upon. And then I subsequently stood up my own business known as Supply Chain Wise. And inside Supply Chain Wise, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to help customers think differently about how they do supply chain. The truth is, the vast majority of people, they want to get out of the supply chain game. So it's something that's done to them. They don't want to deal with it. They find it complex. They try to outsource it. People see it as a cost center to cut revenue, where we're trying to change that paradigm. The truth is you can use supply chains as a genuine differentiator for your business. They can drive innovation into your business. You can change customer experience. You can create new products. You can create new sources of revenue. You just got to think differently about how you get at it. And that's really what we're trying to achieve.
That's fantastic. That's brilliant extra color. Now, listen, before we talk about data, both on the battlefield and military and in business, I want to start with an opening question that's designed to get to the heart of what makes you, you. So can you tell me, John, how do you spend your time?
Well, other than sitting in an office and seemingly for more hours than are allowed, I've got a child who's 11 years old. And for all of you that have got, young children, you'll appreciate that's a really key part of your life. And for me, I'm very aware that at some point he's not going to want to spend as much time with me as he currently does. And therefore, I'm trying to capitalize as much as humanly possible upon that. So it really doesn't matter whether it's playing laser tag, playing Rumble up at Grafton Waters, or whether it's helping him with his homework, and everything and anything that I can do to just be, part of that stage of his life is a core part of my time. I'd love to list all the hobbies that I do, but of course, the vast majority of those are now purely done whilst on holiday.
Very good, very good. Listen, I mean, I have a son who's almost twice as old as yours, who's now in his second year at university. Believe you me, they don't disappear entirely. You put those hard yards in early on, they'll come back for more. Now, listen, could you give us a quick thumbnail sketch? I'm interested in the world of logistics in both the military and in business. But could you maybe give us some key similarities and differences between those two environments in which you've worked?
Sure. And, let's sort of reflect upon the similarities for just a moment. So a bit like any environment, one of the key things about supply chain is how you choose to define it. And if you take the broadest definition, meaning end-to-end from point of extraction through to manufacture, through consumption, ultimate utilization, and then the reverse logistics for end-of-life management, then in some regards, this is the same problem that all organizations have. And the challenges around end-tier supplier integration, so understanding what your supply base is, who it comprises of, where are they located, what risks you have within that, is pertinent whether you are manufacturing fighter jets or whether you're manufacturing training ships. The challenge is the same for both of them. And that is that in the end, your tier one supply base, those that are closest to you, you have a good billing relationship with them. You've got a good personal relationships with them. You understand who they are. You understand the contractual obligations. But getting behind that tier one, getting into the tier threes, the tier fours, that's hard because there are contractual reasons why your suppliers are not going to want to expose who the various components are, which means that ultimately you can have a huge amount of overlap at that level. So you might have, all of the tier one suppliers using the same tier four supplier for a particular widget. And that, of course, exposes you to risk that you can't see. So from that aspect, a huge amount of similarity in terms of the supply base. The other thing that is remarkably similar is to do with finance, and it's to do with the funding of your procurement strategy. And whether you are dealing with a business that is required to remain profitable, or whether you're doing business with a public sector organization that is held to account by the taxpayer, the same challenges are true. Are you procuring using a capital expenditure sort of model where you're effectively trying to buy the entire thing upfront in one payment or one transaction or one known cost? Or are you procuring using a use by or how could we describe it? A pay-per-use model. And if you reflect upon the industry that I'm now focused on, cloud computing, especially at the AWS remit, is very much a pay-per-use model. And that is a fundamental difference from how most people are accustomed to procuring things like their technology. So I share that because this is true whether you're trying to purchase a fighter jet, whether you're going to lease the number of hours that it's going to provide, are you going to buy the jet outright and do the full servicing yourself, et cetera, et cetera. All of those are very similar, whether you're talking about military aspects or civil. Other things that are also very similar is to do with the individuals and the involved in the management of the supply chain and the logistics. These are not different beasts. They tend to be people that are very analytical in nature. They tend to have a very clear view as to the data requirements, and they tend to want to manage things in a data way. And I say tend to want to quite deliberately, because more often than not, entire operations are actually underpinned by one critical tool, and that is Microsoft Excel. So you can have mass operations where we are talking about the movement of large quantities of people, maybe for a humanitarian operation, or you could be talking about a multi-billion-dollar business that is involved in moving bulk fuel around the world. In both of those cases, when you really dig into the detail, what you tend to find is that despite all the sophisticated planning software, tools, and applications that exist, in the end, you've got column A to column Z with a whole bunch of rows and people making up various macros to evaluate what's going on. Ultimately, the problem with that is that because your entire operation is underpinned by Excel, is that you have all sorts of issues with data sharing, data quality, and that ultimately causes tribal knowledge and tribal challenges when it comes to then subsequently managing the strategic operation that you're involved in. So I share that because all of the similarities, both the positives and the negatives, exist. In terms of key differences, well, there are industries that have got parallels with defense, but if we focus on one ultimate difference, is that in a business, it's about profitability. And therefore, that profitability can drive things like inventory optimization. So if you take an organization world-renowned for inventory optimization, such as the motor industry, automotive, what you'll find there is that just on time is critical. But in a military context, just on time would always be too late because we don't know what's going to happen, and therefore we have to store to a contingency planning. So what we end up with is detailed contingency plans and the ability to hold large quantities of inventory on hand just in case. There are challenges with that, but I'm sure you'll think some of those out with me in a moment. So that would be a key difference, is that the bulk storage of inventory is something that would be problematic for most industry. Now, I don't want to be oversimplifying, because the truth is the huge majority of organizations in the defense space are civil organizations, all of whom will seek to optimize their own inventory. So I'm talking specifically about military, supply chain, military logistics in this grasp. The other aspect is that in the civil context, an awful lot of what's going on are knowns. So we know where the stores are. We know where our distribution centers are. We know the paths that we can take to travel between them. We know the quantity of trucks available, etc., etc. Where in a military context, it's entirely possible, if we're talking about a fluid operation, that we don't yet know where the warehouses are going to be. We don't yet know which paths and routes we can take. We don't yet know which paths and routes are currently safe to move along. And we also have challenges around optimizing inventory. But what is also problematic there is that human lives are at risk in every logistics operation that we conduct. And whether we look at counterinsurgency operations where logistics patrols are heavily targeted, or whether you look at contemporary, sort of more full-scale war, if you look at what's happening with Russia and Ukraine today, what you will also see is that the logistics nodes are fundamentally targeted, whether that be main supply routes, MSRs, or whether that be critical components such as bridges, infrastructure such as railway terminals, or indeed even the logistics posts themselves. So in those instances, you could have your inventory destroyed. You could be denied the ability to use particular bridges, paths, routes, and vehicle movements. So from that perspective, that is a fundamental difference between the military and civil context.
Good one. Really, really, really good one. Now, thinking about your time in the RAF in Kandahar and Basra and elsewhere, I'm not trying to draw a kind of facile difference, but it's much more life and death than most of our listeners and viewers are ever likely to face in their working lives. Can you give us a bit of a feel about how data is used in the RAF, but in the military more broadly, perhaps, to make these life and death decisions?
As with so many things in life, I think most military actors would shy away from the notion of the life and death decisions, because the truth is 99.999% of the decisions you're making, are relatively routine for most and not so time sensitive. But you're quite right to say that there are times when you will make deliberate life and death decisions, and we can talk about those in a moment. But there are also times when you make a huge number of decisions that ultimately have a bearing upon the force in which you're either contributing to, protecting, or participating alongside. So thinking about military in general, when you look at something like a naval vessel, what you have is you've actually got a contained organization and or unit, which has got sophisticated sensors, communication tools, dedicated roles that people are all interacting with. And in that instance, the vessel is able to take into account a 360-degree operational picture. Maybe we could talk about subsurface, surface, and air and space. And it's able to take all of those domains into bear, and it's able to utilize the data that it knows about those various domains in order to make operational decisions independently, which is pretty cool. But of course, one vessel operating on its own is not particularly useful. So what is particularly useful is that the vessels also have a sophisticated suite of communication, much beyond flashing lights at each other. and waving flags. So as a result, actually a combination of vessels brings together a host of different operational capabilities. So if you look at something like a carrier strike group where we step up, you now have submarines as part of that. You've got your picket vessels, destroyers, the vessels themselves. Now, I'm not a mariner, so I don't want to go too far beyond my knowledge of this. But what I then want to do is stretch to say that there's no point in having a carrier strike group operating independently without the ability to provide the intelligence surveillance overlay, the ability to provide the refueling capabilities for the jets, the platforms themselves, and of course, any effect that they're going to have is going to be brought to bear in an all-arms capability, meaning that the naval forces must be able to communicate efficiently and effectively with the air forces, which must be able to communicate efficiently and effectively with the land forces. And all of those forces must be able to then bring about one operational impact that they seek to achieve across whichever environment that they're operating. And the reason why I share that is because no matter where you start, whether you talk about a ship as I just did, or whether you talk about an infantier standing on the battlefield, the ability to communicate, the ability to share the operational picture, the ability to bring all of that sophistication that is the UK Armed Forces and or our NATO allies to bear is all fundamentally dependent upon data. And that is something that is quite an interesting overlay and quite an interesting complexity. So when we then imagine about, in that context, the sorts of decisions that can be taken, you could be a unit commander that is dealing with a infantry soldier or a group of soldiers that have come under contact with the enemy, so being shot at or being engaged in some way. That unit is going to seek to bring potentially some kind of air asset in to support, and that could be a medevac to evacuate any casualties, both friendly or enemy, or it could be an air asset that is designed to deter the continuation of the threat. There are a huge number of decisions being taken. So if I move a fast jet stack, so a number of jets towards the contact point, what I'm actually doing is extending their distance from maybe a support asset, or I'm burning a set amount of fuel from each of those assets that's going to require replenishment from an air tanker, or I'm burning additional fuel from the surveillance aircraft that is required to coordinate the air operation, because now we're actually moving aircraft to a different part of the battlefield. In all instances, what we are completely dependent upon is the accurate sharing of data between all of those areas to enable this one very small tactical effect to happen on the battlefield. At my own level, when we step back to some of the operations you mentioned, whether that be Kandahar Air Base or Basra Air Base, you're facing decisions around, for instance, maybe the place has been subject to indirect fires. So you've had rockets fired at the airbase. So now you will have sensors that will indicate from where the fire started. You'll have sensors that will indicate where the rockets may have landed. You will have observers on the ground that will have identified points of firing and potential points of impact. But you still have air operations that need to continue. You can't deny the air op just because you're being subject to indirect fires. So as a result, you have to be able to take the data from the sensors and match it to the ground. Now, this is a remarkable similarity that happens in civil life as well, which is that there is and has to be a very strong linkage between the physical environment and the virtual environment. Meaning, just because the sensor is indicated that the rocket has hit point X doesn't mean that the rocket actually hit point X. There will be a degree of error associated with the sensor and the observer. So that ability to confirm the physical and the virtual becomes critical because it informs decision making. So for example, did the rocket hit the runway? That's an important thing to know. Is there foreign object, debris potentially on the airfield that needs to be cleared prior to any air operation starting, etc.? So all of those things are all data-driven decisions that as an operator, you're having to make every minute of every day. And of course, like I mentioned, I haven't mentioned one that requires an immediate use of deadly force. I've mentioned many that require a lot of coordination and a lot of positioning activity before you can even make a decision associated with fire, don't fire. So there's a whole amount of complexity, layers upon layers of complexity before you get to that sort of level. One thing that is very important, though, is that you cannot allow decision paralysis to set. And what I mean by that is, we go back to what I mentioned about the similarities, about logistics operators being very analytical people. That, however, can sometimes drive people to want to have all the data before they make a decision. And whether you're in the civil aspect or in the military, you're not going to have a perfect situation. Otherwise, there's no decision to be made. So from that perspective, it's very important that people are also accustomed to and are willing to make decisions with the available information that they have. And the available information could be nothing more than a telephone call or a third-party piece of data or something that you have observed yourself. So from that perspective, the ability to make decisions without data is just as important as the ability to understand what the data is telling you.
That's absolutely fascinating. When you started talking about all of the different elements, all of the different sensors, all of the different data sets, the first word that came into my mind was this ecosystem that you're building up. And then I went a bit not a bit green, but I've recently read a couple of books about what we're beginning to understand about fungi and mushrooms that exist in the so-called wood wide web, connecting all living kind of plants. And then I kind of thought, well, actually, that's a bit one-dimensional. And then the other thing that came into my mind was a business ecosystem, was a market, was an international market, was competitors who have marketing plans which you have no idea at all. Probably developed. I've worked with many major multinationals over the years, and I've led and taken part in many what they call war games, perhaps slightly laughably called war games. But imagining what's going to happen when we're launching this new super concentrated laundry liquid against the established, and all of the market data and the analyst data and the kind of stock keeping level, the SKU level, sales data across the retail estate, and so on. And it's made me think. You've made me think. I mean, I think my fungi analogy is not a good one, but perhaps the market analogy is one where and you talked before about knowns and unknowns, and clearly there are a huge number of unknowns. We don't know if a new competitor is going to launch. We don't know if the established competition is suddenly going to go from physical to entirely digital. So that's I think the power of analogy can be very helpful. I hope I'm not pulling that too far with the market. The field of competition in a market and the field of competition in war. Can you tell, and in defence, but can you tell me the process of transition for you personally from the theatre of defence and military to the boardroom? How did you find that process of transition? Because you appear to have gone from one to the other kind of almost seamlessly.
Yeah, it's an interesting piece. I mean, I don't want to underplay, because every individual story of moving from the military into civil society is very different. And there are people, who find it exceptionally tough, if not impossible. And there are others who transition very easily and move on, or should I say, seemingly very easily and move on. And one thing that I've learned in all of those journeys is that you should never observe someone's life remotely and assume, therefore, that everything must be rosy because they have the big car, the big house, and seemingly getting on with life. There's always a backstory to everyone, no matter how successful they may appear. But in terms of my personal journey, I think it matters how you leave, and it matters the terms under which you leave. So I had spent, my contract really was 16 years. So I had done an additional 2 years beyond that in order to take command of 27 Squadron, which was an absolutely fantastic experience and something that, I would never regret doing. It was an absolutely fantastic opportunity, great people, a great time in my life. So it was fantastic fun. But at the same time, I knew for sure that I was definitely leaving. And because I knew for sure that I was definitely leaving, it was very clear in my mind's eye what I needed to fill in terms of skill gaps in order to be able to make that transition successful. What is more, I lived on a military base. In 18 years, I've only lived on one military base. And I did that for 2 years. And it was something that we deliberately chose to never to do. So as a result, I've always lived in the community, and I've always lived as part of the community. So I'm always very aware that for most people, the military, really is something that is just another job, or is just another part of life. And, most people, despite, or how frustrating it could be. Most people don't, and I say care, I mean it quite flippantly. Most people don't really care too much about whether it's Air Force, Army, or Navy, or whether it's para or the RAF regiment or whichever. People don't really care about that detail. Super supportive of the military, very very comfortable what we do, but in the end, it's not something that's on the dinner table for most people most of the time. So I don't think I was really that overly indoctrinated from that perspective in terms of my personal living experience and my sort of circle of friends outside of the military. So that also helped transition. So those things are important. What is also important is the amount of support that I've received in that transition period. There has not been a single person who I've contacted and said, can you offer me 10 minutes, 13 minutes worth of support to have a conversation about something? And in every instance, people have picked up the phone and spoken and provided nothing but support and a real sense of community when one doesn't exist. And that has been worth its weight in gold. So any success that I've had has been down to a willingness of many, many, many people to pick up the phone and help. And I hope that I've repaid that favor as often as I can, because anyone who's ever picked up the phone to me is I've always made time, or at least I believe I've always made time to spend a few moments and talk through. And for anyone that I haven't made time, feel free to give me a shout, because I will put right any mistakes that I've made. The other thing, though, was an incredible amount of luck. So Amazon reached out, one of the recruiters, Kieran Lyons, really good guy, reached out and said, John, would you consider working for Amazon? And of course, my immediate answer was no, why would I? That's, you guys do screensavers and move boxes. I'm currently part of this, military enterprise. I was much more focused on what that would mean and much more focused on joining the financial services, which was a well-trodden path. Spent many a day sitting at Canary Wharf having tea with people various. But I went on the journey with Amazon. I got into the first series of interviews, more to get experience. The last time I was interviewed was in 1999, and it was now 2017. So it was great to go on that journey and experience. And what I found was that the people who were interviewing me, I really liked a lot. And I liked where they were coming from, and I liked the attitude, and I liked the intelligence that I experienced. And therefore, really, it came down to, if those very clever people from some of the best schools in the country are opting to have Amazon as a career, what am I not seeing? So that's really where it was kind of, let's go for it and see what happens. So we took the job expecting to do no more than a year, truth be told. But 6 years later, I'd become a bar raiser within the business. I had set up new businesses. I created 2 new businesses within Amazon. I had learned my craft because of, Amazon is a very hard taskmaster. So there was lots of really clever people challenging every decision and forcing you to make better decisions at every turn. So it was a real environment to learn. And in that instance, it was very similar to the military in so much as, the terminology people were using, the leadership principles, the cultural expectations were all very similar. And I find that really useful. What I find very different, and I think this is something that the military could really learn from, is the diversity of the leadership team was huge. And I actually find it quite interesting when I was listening to one senior leader some time back in the UK military. I won't name who they were. But she said, one great thing about the military is that we all think alike. Words to that fact. And I find that really quite challenging to listen to, because to me, that's the opposite of what a good leader should be looking for. And that we should always be looking for challenge, diversity of opinion, and strong views. And we should actively encourage people to think differently and to challenge, when appropriate, decisions, especially those of our senior leaders.
I think that's a fascinating observation. So that's what military. Well, that's one thing that military could learn from the world of business in terms of diversity of thought and diversity of leadership. Anything else that you think military could learn from the world of business? And then to flip the question on its head, what can business learn from the world of the military?
So continuing down the path of what the military. So when I reflect upon what I know now and what I wish I'd known whilst I was serving. What I find is that the UK military has some of the most sophisticated equipment on the modern battlefield, whether it be our recent purchase of the Archer artillery systems, whether it be the aircraft carriers that we mentioned previously, or whether it be the F-35 fighter. We could take into account things like Poseidon in the maritime logistics space and other sophisticated systems. But what is missing is the connectivity that enables all of these systems to truly perform in a meaningful way. And we still have air gap systems where people are moving data physically between sensors, or you have contractors who are, they are building platforms that don't communicate with other platforms, deliberately building platforms that don't communicate with other platforms because they seek to have vendor lock-in. And you have procurement teams that seem to have challenges with understanding modern contractual arrangements that could be put in place to demand and necessitate an evergreen environment in the technical space. That's changing. I've been out now for the best part of 7 years, so undoubtedly an awful lot of this will have moved on. But I do still stay in touch with some of the civil aspects that are going into defense, and some of those things are still true, that we still have underdeveloped technical resources to execute. The other thing is that when you look at Amazon has a huge amount of automated systems. Automated systems meaning that Amazon doesn't have a group of individuals that phone up and try to buy X number of PlayStations from a wholesaler. That's done by, we know, because we've got advanced analytics, how many PlayStations are likely to be required in any given market at any given time by the sheer ordering and other data that we have. So as a result, the system will put automated requests out to procure that volume. And it will take into account things like currency fluctuations, etc. Defense doesn't have that degree of sophistication embedded into its planning. And a huge amount of this is, a huge amount of military planning is math. And if you think about, the simple aspects of that, the ability to use math to be able to improve operational planning, operational flow, and automation, it's not only something that is required, it is something that is absolutely demanded in the modern battlefield. And I fear that often we learn lessons based on the wars that we've fought and not the wars that we see being fought. So if we look at the wars that we have fought recently, we spent many years in Afghanistan, we spent many years in Iraq, and I hate to characterize them as wars, but I will just for the purpose of conversation. And in those conflicts, the truth is we were fighting insurgents and still having significant operational challenges around simple things like sustaining the force. When you look at what's happening in Ukraine with Russia today, the notion that you're going to have a large command node that's going to sit around and plan centrally all aspects of the operation would seem counter to what we see happening. And if we believe that to be true, then we're going to see junior commanders having to make strategic decisions. And if junior commanders have to make strategic decisions, then they need the data. But not only that, they're likely to be actually live dealing with challenge. So they actually need decision support. And when you think about decision support, it means taking the pressure off people. And it could be simple things. Like, for example, you will see staff officers pulling out these very thick books. And in those books, it will determine how many people a Puma helicopter can carry versus a Chinook, and whether those people are carrying full load, light loads, or whether they're operating at altitudes of X, Y, and Z, and so forth. And there's all sorts of parameters that are all there. But like I mentioned, all of those parameters are math, and they're all known. So they're not, you don't need to go to a book to get that. That is known. So really, the ability to have decision support at the very lowest level could improve the ability for people to operate efficiently and effectively. So what could business learn from the military? One of the challenges within the civil area can be one of buying into a strategic vision or a strategic notion. A large number of times, employers are just that. They're just an employer. And yes, the employer will want to have a culture, and they will create various posters of cats with little smiley faces, and they will put terms underneath them to create that notion of something bigger than the employees themselves, something there, something that is meaningful, doing good in the world. But organizations can be pretty poor at that, especially very traditional businesses that don't really get the whole challenge around retaining and recruiting talent. And they find themselves in this continuous circle of going, well, we are insert X and we are the world's leader of insert whatever it is. That's not good enough anymore. People are coming to work because, and they can choose where they work. People are coming to work because they want to improve the world. They want, so it's the usual story. Am I learning? Then I'll stay and work. Am I earning? Then I might choose to stay and work. But earning on its own with no learning is not going to result in a long-term hire and a long-term retention. So we have to encourage organizations, as the military does, to, and I use the term indoctrinate. I don't mean it in the sort of the nasty ways in which people would often refer to it, but to indoctrinate people into the culture of your organization. But that means that the culture of the organization can't be something you simply dream up. It has to be, people have to believe it. It's not, they have to believe it. People have to drink from the Kool-Aid, and they have to recognize that this is a organization that is there for the greater good of whatever it's going to be. And we see the agility of startups in this space because they're able to create that environment. But there is a challenge, and this is where militaries can also help teach society. The challenge is that there's some golden rules about team leadership, and it's math again. One person can directly influence 3 other people quite easily. One person can lead through persuasion and just simply force of character, circa 12 people, quite comfortably. But once you start getting into a magic number approaching somewhere around 80 to 90, your personality and your ability to just simply cut around and drive innovation starts to wane quickly. And this is the point at which bureaucracy is important. Because at the point at which we're going to get above this magic number, and you see it, whether it be Roman legions that were never actually 100, so a century was never actually 100. It was always about 70, 80, 90. I could argue for this very reason, because once you get into the 100, it becomes really typical. So there's an awkward number between sort of 12 and 14, often referred to as the Judas group, for those from a Christian sort of background. And then there's an awkward number where we start breaking beyond that sort of 80, 90 number. But it gets even harder, because once you get up to an organization that's circa 1,200 people, now we're into a very different dynamic. For organizations below about 1,200, chances are you're going to feel familiar. There will be people that you will have seen around on tea breaks and coffee breaks and lunch breaks. And it's like a small town. You're just familiar. You don't know everybody, but Mrs. Miggins always walks her dog down the street at about this time. So you've got that sort of familiarity. But once you get above that number, it changes again, because a lot of that familiarity goes. So at that sort of small unit commander, 80 to 90 people, there are challenges around building processes to lead your team effectively. When you get to 1,200, those processes are going to be tested, meaningfully tested, as to whether you can actually manage that unit. But once you get beyond 1,200 and you're now dealing with the blobs of several thousand at a time, it's all mechanisms. All mechanisms. And just to be super clear in this whole agenda, in case someone thinks that the cultural discussion I was having earlier supersedes that, it really doesn't. Because the one thing that we should always remember is that good intentions don't work. Okay? Good intentions don't work. So that means that if I've got an organization of circa 3,000 people, and what I want is for that 3,000 people to increase production by, say, 1%, which would seem to be a reasonable thing to ask. Every one of those people that come to work already think they're working hard, already think they're part of an organization that's great because, John's created this culture and it's absolutely fantastic. So, not that I can do that. But as a result, all these people think they're already working hard. So asking them to work harder is going to have no improvement in performance. So that means that you have to have a mechanism to be able to actually drive an improvement. And that could mean, for instance, forcing people to use a particular tool to record the hours that they're working with customers so that you can see the total utilization if you were in a professional services organization. Or it could be because we want to increase diversity hiring. It could be a mechanism that deliberately counts visible diversity within the workforce, so that you can actually call out which parts of the organization are growing and which organizations are not growing. But either way, good intentions don't work. And that's something that, again, can be taught from the military into the civil area, because the military does not depend upon, individuals' good intentions, and instead has got a very structured bureaucratical system that is designed to drive forward programmatically decisions that are taken.
Terrific stuff. I love your magic numbers. And the point about the Roman centurion is very well made. I've seen from a psychological standpoint argued before that the reason that typical pre-agricultural conurbations, if you want to call them that, villages were typically no more than 150 people is because that's about the number that the human brain can actually remember the intimate details of the interrelationships between. And once you get, as you say, to that 1,200 figure, then you're into a different area. Listen, that is absolutely fascinating. We tend to run these sessions for kind of 40, 45 minutes or so. I wanted to ask you just a couple more questions, if that's possible. One is what would be the example of the worst misuse of data that you've ever observed in your career, either military or in business?
Well, look, the single biggest thing about data, whether it's civil, military, or scientific studies, is when people come in with an answer and they find the data to solve their answer. And we see that in every single walk of life. So there's an underlying thing to bear in mind when you are considering this. If everything feels rosy, if every time you're speaking to people, it feels comfortable, if every time you're interacting with a staff paper, you're hearing what you want to hear and you're seeing what you want to see, you're wrong. Something is wrong, because the truth is spiky, it's uncomfortable, and it causes problems. And if it isn't spiky, and if it isn't uncomfortable, and if it isn't causing problems, then you're surrounded by yes people. And you need to change. You need to change your entire view. Similarly, if you are, and people are, if you are deliberately manipulating data or a viewpoint on data or excluding numbers to drive forward your argument at the expense of the truth, then in the end, you're going to fail. You're going to fail, and it's just a matter of time. And you're either going to fail because, worst case scenario, you're brought up in a court of law and someone is calling out your failures to you step by step, or you're being called out by a customer because you've sold them a contract that doesn't work, and you're being called out step by step, or you've put in place a political policy that is ultimately wrong, and you're in the media every minute of every day, justifying why it is that you can't see what everybody else can see.
I love that point about kind of hypothesis testing or hypothesis proving rather than hypothesis testing. A recent guest on the podcast, the forensic scientist Dr. Professor Angela Gallup, has written a book all about forensics and all about what she learned through a career of particularly solving cold cases. And that book is called "When the Dogs Don't Bark." So when the dogs do bark, when the data is there and is showing you what you want, what you expect, and it's proving your hypothesis, that's when you need to be worried. Where you really need to look and sniff out and listen is when the dogs don't bark. Now, finally, before we talk about where our listeners and viewers can find more about you and your business, John, is there anything I haven't asked you that I should have asked you? A Columbo question, if you like.
There's probably 1,000,001 things that will come to mind as soon as we hang up from this call. All of my best answers do that to me, especially when I think of amusing things to say to people in the bar. But one of the things that's interesting is how do you create a culture that is data driven? And that's a really hard question, because I get asked that a lot. How do you create a data driven culture? And when I think back to days of old, what we would have done is we would have stood up with various PowerPoint presentations, and you would present the graphs that are half truths, and you would have presented graphs that looked like they were straight out of a red tabloid newspaper, with the scales adjusted to demonstrate your point. and you would stand up and deliver set presentation if you had any data at all. And what enabled that decision to be passed was the personality of the person presenting and the quality of the fonts that they'd used in their PowerPoint, and whether they had animation or no animation, depending upon whether individuals liked or disliked animation. But what it means, actually, is that there's no data-driven discussion. What it actually also means is that those who win are extroverts, willing to stand up and present in a very meaningful way, in a very forceful way. What we have in Amazon was a narrative culture. And what this means is that when you go into a meeting in Amazon, everybody's handed a 6-page document in the meeting physically, and no one talks. So the person will introduce the paper. Thank you all for coming, ladies and gentlemen. Narrative's in front of you. I'll give you a shout in 35 minutes, and then I'll check in with time, following which we will then start the conversation. Silence. Why? Well, first of all, nobody's going to read it before you come to the meeting, and don't kid yourself that people will. They won't. If you're in the room, you read the narrative. The comments are about qualifying the narrative, asking questions about the data, asking questions about the story, about the narrative, not arguing with the story, not arguing whether you agree or disagree about the narrative. Then after that, we can have a conversation about where we're going. Because you see, if the data is accurate, and we all agree that the data is accurate, and we agree that the person has made the correct interpretation of the data, then it's not a story anymore about whether I like Dave, Tom, Dick, or Harry. It's now a story about, are we going to put this initiative into action over all of the other initiatives that we have? And if we are, then we probably need another narrative that explains which actions we're going to take from all of the narratives that we have. So I share that with you because I think for a lot of organizations, the way that you get into a data-driven culture is by senior leaders demanding data. And if you don't demand data, then you'll never have a data-driven culture.
It's so good to hear. You're not the first person I've spoken to who's worked in Amazon. But I think you've expressed the rationale behind the legendary 6-page memo that I think started with, as I understand it, started with Jeff Bezos. That's the way he wanted communication to be done. You've expressed that so beautifully and so clearly, and how that actually leads to the creation of the data-driven culture. John, that's fantastic. Now, can you tell me where should our listeners, our viewers, find you on social media, online? Where can they find you most reliably?
Sure. I mean, the business itself is Supply Chain Wise, and simply supplychainwise.com. Look us up. Or alternatively, John McFall 5 is my login handle, as it were. There were 5 more before me, believe it or not. On LinkedIn, please just drop me a line. Very happy to connect with people. Very happy to have a conversation about any aspects of supply chain and/or life in general.
Thank you so much for your time, John, for sharing your approach to using data smarter in what to many people are radically different environments. I think if there were only more people with your approach to using data smarter, there'd be a lot less malarkey in the world of logistics, a lot more data common sense. John McFall, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Pleasure. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.